On the morning of June 15, 1944, a young Marine named Tony Stein found himself pressed against the dark volcanic sand of Saipan's beaches in the Mariana Islands. He was just 19 years old, serving as a machine gunner with the 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines of the 4th Marine Division. Through the smoke and chaos of the amphibious landing, he heard something approaching that sent ice through his veins. It wasn't the organized sound of a military advance. It was something far more terrifying. Hundreds of voices shouting in unison, boots hammering against sand, the metallic clatter of bayonets being fixed to rifles. Everything in his training told him to wait. Hold your fire, conserve ammunition, wait for orders. That was the doctrine drilled into every machine gunner at Camp Pendleton. The Browning M1919 medium machine gun was not a weapon for individual heroics. It was a crew-served weapon requiring discipline and coordination. Machine guns were treated as curved fire weapons, meaning they required careful planning and execution. The doctrine was crystal clear. You waited for the fire command from your squad leader. You made sure your fire coordinated with adjacent positions to create overlapping fields of fire. You conserved your ammunition because once those cloth belts ran dry, you were defenseless. Stein's weapon held a belt of 250 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition. At sustained rates of fire, that would last about 90 seconds. After that, his assistant gunner would need to reload while Stein covered with his rifle. But there was a problem. His assistant gunner was dead, killed 20 minutes earlier by Japanese mortar fire during the chaotic landing. Stein was alone with his gun, with perhaps 3 spare ammunition belts, facing a decision that violated everything the Marine Corps had taught him. The voices grew louder. Through the smoke kicked up by naval bombardment and ongoing artillery exchanges, Stein could now see them. Not a tactical advance with proper fire and maneuver, but a human wave moving toward American lines. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers with fixed bayonets and rifles at port arms. Some carried swords, others wielded bamboo spears. They were shouting Banzai, the traditional battle cry meaning 10,000 years, invoking the emperor's eternal reign. They were perhaps 200 yards away, moving across open ground toward the hastily established Marine defensive positions. The tactical situation was desperate. The 4th Marine Division had landed less than 3 hours earlier against fierce resistance. The beach was a nightmare of congestion, equipment, supplies, and casualties. Medical corpsmen worked frantically to evacuate wounded men back to landing craft. Amphibious vehicles were still bringing supplies ashore while taking fire from Japanese positions on the ridgeline overlooking the beaches. The Marines hadn't yet consolidated their perimeter. Gaps existed between units. Communication lines weren't established. Artillery support was minimal because the big guns were still being offloaded from ships. The defensive line was thin, undermanned, and vulnerable. Stein understood the mathematics with perfect clarity. If this Japanese charge reached American positions, they would break through. Once through the beach defenses, they would reach supply dumps, medical stations, command posts. They would kill wounded Marines who couldn't defend themselves. They would destroy ammunition and equipment just brought ashore. They would throw the entire landing operation into chaos, possibly forcing a withdrawal back to the ships. Everything depended on stopping them here, in the open ground between the ridgeline and the beach. Stein was one man with 1 machine gun and approximately 750 rounds of ammunition. The approaching Japanese force numbered at least 300 men, possibly more. Fire discipline doctrine demanded he wait for orders, coordinate with adjacent positions, conserve ammunition. But there were no orders coming. His squad leader was somewhere else on the beach. Radio communication wasn't functioning. Adjacent positions were too far away to coordinate with effectively. The Japanese were now 150 yards away and closing fast. The Browning M1919 was the product of John Moses Browning's genius, refined through decades of military use since the First World War. The weapon weighed 31 pounds without its tripod, 41 pounds with the mount. It fired the standard .30-06 Springfield cartridge at a cyclic rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute, though doctrine called for sustained fire at no more than 150 rounds per minute to prevent barrel overheating. The effective range was approximately 1,500 yards against area targets. Marine Corps machine gun doctrine in 1944 was sophisticated, the product of lessons learned in previous campaigns. Machine guns weren't individual weapons. They were crew-served weapons requiring at minimum 3 men. The gunner who fired the weapon, the assistant gunner who fed ammunition and helped move the gun, and an ammunition carrier who brought forward the heavy cloth belts and provided security. In practice, A well-functioning machine gun section included 4 to 6 men. Tactical employment doctrine emphasized careful planning and fire discipline. Machine gunners didn't fire at will. They fired on command, coordinating with other weapons to create interlocking fields of fire. The principle was simple but essential. If every machine gun covered gaps in adjacent positions, no enemy could advance without entering someone's field of fire. Premature firing by one gun could alert the enemy and draw concentrated fire that would destroy the position before the main attack began. Ammunition. Conservation was drilled into every machine gunner from basic training forward. Each cloth belt weighed approximately 7 pounds when loaded with 250 rounds. Carrying sufficient ammunition for sustained operations was physically demanding. Resupply during combat was dangerous and often impossible. A machine gunner who fired wildly at the beginning of an engagement would find himself defenseless when the critical moment arrived. Doctrine emphasized short, controlled bursts, 3 to 5 round bursts for point targets, longer bursts only when engaging massed formations, or when final protective fire was called. Final protective fire was the ultimate emission of defensive machine guns, a predetermined line across the front where machine guns would concentrate fire when the position was in danger of being overrun. The fire command meant the situation was desperate. It meant fire without regard to ammunition conservation, without regard to barrel life, without regard to anything except stopping the enemy immediately. But final protective fire was supposed to come as a command from leadership, coordinated across the entire defensive line. It wasn't supposed to be an individual decision made by a single gunner acting alone. The Marine Corps in 1944 was built on discipline, on following orders, on coordinating actions with the larger tactical plan. Individual initiative was valued in certain contexts, but machine gunners were expected to follow doctrine. The weapon was too important, ammunition too valuable, consequences of premature fire too severe to leave such decisions to individual judgment. Stein had absorbed this doctrine through months of training. He understood the reasons behind it. He knew firing too early could compromise the defensive position. He knew wasting ammunition could leave him helpless later. He knew revealing his position without coordination could draw concentrated enemy fire. Every instructor had emphasized these points. Every training exercise reinforced them. Every critique stressed the importance of fire discipline and ammunition conservation. The doctrine wasn't arbitrary. It was based on hard-won experience from previous wars and earlier Pacific campaigns. At Guadalcanal in 1942, Marine machine gunners learned the cost of poor fire discipline when Japanese infiltration tactics isolated guns that had revealed their positions prematurely. At Tarawa in 1943, ammunition shortages during critical first hours ashore demonstrated the importance of conservation. The doctrine existed because it saved lives and won battles. The Japanese tactical doctrine that Stein faced had its own logic and history. The Banzai charge, properly understood, wasn't a suicidal gesture of fanaticism. It was a calculated tactical response to specific battlefield conditions, rooted in Japanese military tradition and adapted to material realities of the Pacific War. The term Banzai itself carried cultural weight that Western observers often misunderstood. It wasn't a death cry, but a celebration of the emperor, an invocation of loyalty to the imperial institution that defined Japanese national identity. When Japanese soldiers shouted Banzai while attacking, they weren't expressing a desire to die. They were expressing willingness to risk death in service of something they believed was eternal and worthy of ultimate sacrifice. The tactical roots lay in Japanese military doctrine developed during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Japanese military theorists studying that war concluded that spirit and aggressive action could overcome material disadvantages. By 1944, however, the Banzai charge had evolved from a doctrine of aggressive maneuver into something else, a last desperate gamble by forces lacking material means for conventional defense. On Saipan, the Japanese garrison understood their situation clearly. American naval supremacy meant no reinforcements would arrive. American air superiority meant Japanese positions would be bombed and strafed continuously. American artillery would pound defensive positions day and night. The material disparity was overwhelming. Faced with certain eventual defeat through attrition, Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific adopted a strategy of inflicting maximum casualties on American forces before their own inevitable destruction. The Banzai charge, when properly timed and executed, could achieve this goal more effectively than passive defense. A well-coordinated attack against American positions, not yet fully consolidated, could potentially break through defensive lines, reach rear areas, and create chaos that might delay American operations for days or weeks. Psychological burden of defending against such attacks fell disproportionately on machine gunners like Stein. They occupied positions at critical points in defensive lines, places where terrain channeled attacking forces, where fields of fire were most advantageous, where a single weapon with sufficient ammunition could theoretically stop dozens or hundreds of attackers. The Doctrine placed enormous trust in these young men, most barely out of their teens, to make split-second decisions under extreme stress while adhering to fire discipline that seemed impossibly restrictive. Training at Camp Pendleton tried to prepare them. Live fire exercises simulated defensive scenarios. Instructors emphasized remaining calm, controlling breathing, selecting targets deliberately rather than firing wildly. They taught mechanical skills of loading belts, clearing jams, adjusting for range and windage. They drilled physical movements until they became automatic. But no training could fully prepare a 19-year-old for the psychological reality of hundreds of men running toward him, shouting in a foreign language, knowing his individual decision in the next few seconds would determine whether they died or whether they reached his position and killed him. Training hadn't prepared him for being alone with that decision. Without a squad leader to give the fire command, without an assistant gunner to provide reassurance through simple presence, without any communication with adjacent positions to confirm his action would coordinate with the larger defensive plan. Stein watched them come closer, 100 yards now, close enough to see individual faces, to distinguish officers with swords from enlisted men with rifles, to notice some attackers were already wounded from naval bombardment, close enough to be certain that if he didn't fire soon, they would reach his position before he could effectively engage them. Doctrine demanded he wait for orders. The situation demanded he fire immediately. He made his decision. Stein's hands moved with the automaticity that training had built into muscle memory. His right hand gripped the spade grip at the rear of the Browning, his thumb resting on the butterfly trigger. His left hand steadied the barrel, feeling the warmth of metal already fired during earlier skirmishes. The tripod was properly positioned, legs spread at correct angles to absorb recoil. The traversing and elevating mechanism allowed him to swing the gun across his assigned sector. The ammunition belt fed from the left side of the weapon, cloth loops holding individual cartridges in precise alignment. Each cartridge was a self-contained unit of potential energy, a brass case holding 50-some grains of smokeless powder, a 150-grain boat-tail bullet with a gilding metal jacket, and a primer that would ignite the powder when struck by the firing pin. When the trigger was pressed, the weapon would fire, the barrel would recoil, the bolt would cycle backward, extracting the spent casing and chambering the next round, and the process would repeat approximately 500 times per minute until the trigger was released or ammunition exhausted. Stein had fired thousands of rounds through weapons like this during training. He knew the sound of proper functioning, the rhythm of sustained fire, the slight variations in recoil that indicated whether the gun was operating correctly. He knew how to clear typical malfunctions. He knew the theoretical maximum effective range of 1,500 yards, and the practical reality that hitting individual targets beyond 600 yards required luck as much as skill. What training hadn't fully conveyed was the psychological weight of the decision he now faced. The Japanese attackers were 75 yards away, close enough that he could see expressions on their faces. They weren't the faceless enemy of training exercises, not paper silhouettes on rifle ranges or distant figures in orientation films. They were individual human beings, young men not fundamentally different from himself, running toward him with weapons raised and death in their immediate future, regardless of what he did. If he fired, he would kill dozens of them in the next minute. If he didn't fire, they would reach his position and kill him, then continue into American rear areas where wounded Marines lay helpless. Doctrine said wait for orders. Reality said there were no orders coming. Doctrine said conserve ammunition. Reality said ammunition was worthless if the position was overrun. Doctrine said coordinate with adjacent positions. Reality said he couldn't see adjacent positions through the smoke and couldn't communicate because his radio operator was dead and telephone lines were cut by artillery. Doctrine had been written for ideal conditions with full crews and functioning communications. The situation he faced was far from ideal. Stein made a calculation combining training, instinct, and desperate hope. He would fire one sustained burst to stop the immediate threat, then assess whether he had enough ammunition remaining to defend against follow-on attacks. It was a violation of doctrine, but it was the only decision that made tactical sense given circumstances. His thumb pressed the butterfly trigger. The Browning fired its first round at 08:57 hours on June 15, 1944. Recoil pushed back against the tripod. Muzzle climb was negligible because of proper positioning. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous hammering that drowned out shouting of Japanese attackers and even background noise of naval gunfire and artillery. Spent brass casings ejected from the right side, falling in a growing pile beside the gun position. The cloth ammunition belt fed smoothly through the feed mechanism. Each cartridge cycled into the chamber and fired and ejected in mechanical rhythm that seemed almost independent of human control. Stein traversed the gun slowly from right to left across his sector of fire, training taking over, his conscious mind observing while trained reflexes controlled the weapon. Traces in the ammunition belt, 1 in every 5 rounds, showed him where his fire was going. Red lines arced across the 75 yards, separating his position from attacking Japanese, and where those red lines touched, men fell. The effectiveness shocked him even as his hands continued their work. The 30-06 cartridge was a powerful round, designed decades earlier for long-range rifle fire, but equally effective against human targets at close range. The 150-grain bullets traveled at approximately 2,700 feet per second, carrying enormous kinetic energy. When they struck human bodies, they created devastating wounds. Men hit in the torso fell immediately. Men hit in extremities spun and dropped. The mathematical reality of machine gun fire against massed infantry in the open was brutal and simple. The gun fired faster than men could run, and every bullet that found a target removed one attacker from the assault. The first ammunition belt of 250 rounds lasted approximately 30 seconds. Stein fired in a sustained burst that violated every doctrine about ammunition conservation, but tactical reality justified the violation. The Japanese attack wasn't a probing action or limited objective assault. It was an all-out effort to break through American beach defenses before they could be consolidated. Stopping it required immediate, overwhelming firepower, not carefully measured fire discipline appropriate for prolonged defensive engagement. When the first belt ran empty, Stein's training took over again. His left hand reached for the spare ammunition belt lying beside the gun position, while his right hand opened the feed cover. The weapon was hot now, heat radiating from barrel and receiver, but not yet dangerously overheated. He positioned the new belt, closed the feed cover, pulled the charging handle to chamber the first round, and pressed the trigger again. The entire reload process took perhaps 8 seconds. 8 seconds during which surviving Japanese attackers continued their advance. They were now 50 yards away, close enough that Stein could distinguish individual equipment and weapons. Some carried the standard Arisaka Type 99 rifle, with its distinctive dust cover over the bolt and long bayonet fixed. Others had the shorter Type 44 carbine. A few carried Type 96 light machine guns, the Japanese equivalent of the American Browning automatic rifle. Officers and senior non-commissioned officers carried swords, symbols of authority in the Japanese military, and in this context, utterly useless weapons for modern combat. The second ammunition belt fired with the same mechanical efficiency as the first. Stein traversed the gun continuously, engaging closest threats first, then working outward across his sector. The Japanese advance was faltering now, not from loss of courage or fighting spirit, but from simple mathematics. A Banzai charge required momentum, the psychological and physical pressure of hundreds of men moving together, creating a force individual defenders couldn't stop. But when dozens of those men fell in the first few seconds, when survivors had to climb over bodies and step around wounded comrades while under continuous fire, the momentum died. At 30 yards, the Japanese attack was no longer a coordinated assault, but a collection of individual survivors trying to reach the American position through sheer determination. Some fired rifles while advancing, though accuracy was impossible while running, and the single-shot Arisaka required manual operation of the bolt between shots. A few threw grenades, but the throws fell short, grenades exploding harmlessly in sand between the two forces. Stein fired the second belt to exhaustion, then loaded his third and final spare. His water jacket was steaming now, the cooling system that surrounded the barrel converting water into steam as it absorbed heat from sustained firing. The barrel was approaching temperatures where continued firing would risk damage to the weapon, but stopping wasn't an option. The Japanese were 20 yards away. close enough that small arms fire from individual Marines in adjacent positions was becoming effective. Riflemen who had been pinned down by the initial Japanese advance were now engaging targets, their Springfield and Garand rifles adding their fire to Stein's machine gun. The third ammunition belt ran empty with Japanese soldiers 15 yards from Stein's position. He had fired approximately 750 rounds in less than 2 minutes, an expenditure of ammunition that would have earned severe reprimand in any training exercise. The barrel of his Browning was dangerously hot. Water in the cooling jacket nearly boiled away, the weapon barely functional and requiring immediate maintenance before it could be fired again safely. But the Japanese attack had been stopped. Bodies lay in rough lines across the 75 yards of open ground between Japanese starting positions and the American defensive line. The exact number would never be precisely known, but estimates from Marines who walked the area afterward suggested at least 150 Japanese soldiers had been killed in the assault, with perhaps another 50 wounded. The wounded presented their own terrible problem. Many would die from their injuries without medical attention, but providing that attention was impossible in the middle of a battle zone where Japanese artillery still targeted American positions. Stein sat behind his gun, hands shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, confronting what he had done. He had violated doctrine by firing without orders. He had expended his entire ammunition supply in a single engagement, leaving himself defenseless against follow-on attacks. He had made an individual tactical decision that could have compromised the entire defensive position if he had been wrong about the severity of the threat. By every standard of Marine Corps machine gun doctrine, his actions were questionable at best and potentially subject to disciplinary action. But he had stopped the attack. The Japanese hadn't broken through. Beach defenses remained intact. Wounded Marines in the aid station behind his position were alive because the Japanese hadn't reached them. Supplies stacked on the beach were still available for continuing operations. The command post from which officers coordinated the landing was still functioning. His violation of doctrine had achieved the fundamental purpose of defensive operations, stopping the enemy advance. The silence after sustained machine gun fire wasn't truly silence, but rather a different soundscape that seemed quiet by comparison. Stein could hear continuing naval bombardment from ships offshore, the crack of artillery rounds impacting on Japanese positions in the ridgeline, small arms fire from other sectors where fighting continued, and underneath it all the sounds of wounded men calling for corpsmen. His ears rang from sustained firing, a high-pitched tone that would persist for hours and become a permanent feature of his hearing for the rest of his life. Ammunition resupply arrived 20 minutes after the attack was repulsed, carried forward by Marines from beach supply dumps who crawled and ran through continuing artillery fire. They brought 6 more cloth belts of ammunition, each containing 250 rounds, enough to sustain defensive operations through the rest of the day if fired with proper discipline. They brought water for the gun's cooling jacket, 5-gallon cans sloshing as they were dragged across sand. They brought word that similar attacks had hit other sectors of the beach perimeter and had been repulsed everywhere, though casualties among defenders had been significant. A lieutenant from the battalion staff arrived to assess the situation. He examined Stein's position, looked at piles of spent brass casings, counted empty ammunition belts, and studied the field of fire where Japanese bodies lay in rough lines marking the advance of the attack. He asked Stein a series of questions. When had the attack begun? How many attackers had there been? Had Stein received the order for final protective fire? Why had he fired without coordination with adjacent positions? Did he understand he had violated fire discipline doctrine? Stein answered truthfully. He hadn't received orders because his squad leader was elsewhere and communications weren't functioning. He had fired because the Japanese were going to overrun his position if he hadn't. He understood he had violated doctrine, but believed the tactical situation justified the violation. He had approximately 3 spare ammunition belts at the beginning of the engagement and had fired all of them, plus his initial belt, in stopping the attack. His assistant gunner was dead, killed earlier by mortar fire, leaving him to operate the weapon alone. The lieutenant considered this information, then made a decision, reflecting practical realities of combat versus theoretical ideals of doctrine. Stein had acted appropriately given circumstances. His violation of fire discipline doctrine was justified by the tactical emergency. His expenditure of ammunition had achieved its purpose. His individual initiative had prevented a breakthrough that could have compromised entire beach defenses. Rather than face disciplinary action, Stein would be recommended for recognition of his actions, the conversation, revealed tension inherent in military doctrine between standardized procedures that worked in most situations and individual initiative, required in exceptional circumstances. Doctrine existed because following proven procedures usually produced better outcomes than improvisation. Machine gun fire discipline and ammunition conservation were sound principles backed by decades of experience, but doctrine couldn't account for every possible situation. When communications failed, when crew members were killed, when the tactical situation deviated significantly from planning assumptions, individual Marines had to make decisions based on their training, their understanding of the tactical situation, and their judgment about what would best accomplish the mission. Stein's decision to fire without orders represented successful application of this principle. He had understood both the doctrine and the reasons behind it. He had recognized that specific circumstances of his situation justified deviation from standard procedures. He had accepted the risk of disciplinary action in favor of accomplishing the tactical objective. The psychological burden of his actions wouldn't become fully apparent until later. After adrenaline faded and the immediate tactical situation stabilized, Stein had killed at least several dozen men, and possibly many more in approximately 2 minutes of sustained fire. The exact number was unknowable, because machine gun fire into massed formations made it impossible to attribute individual casualties to specific shooters. But mathematical reality of 750 rounds fired at close range against targets in the open meant a substantial percentage of his bullets had found human targets. Training at Camp Pendleton had prepared him for mechanical tasks of operating the weapon, but hadn't fully prepared him for the psychological reality of killing at scale. Rifle marksmanship training taught Marines to engage individual targets one shot at a time, with clear attribution of each kill to the individual shooter. Machine gun training emphasized the weapon as an area denial tool, firing at grid coordinates or terrain features rather than at individual human beings. The psychological distance created by this training helped Marines perform their duties without being overwhelmed by the moral weight of taking human life. But at point-blank range against massed formations, that psychological distance collapsed. Stein had seen faces of men he killed. He had watched them fall, watched them try to continue advancing while wounded, watched the attack disintegrate under his fire. The memory would remain vivid for the rest of his life, not as trauma in the clinical sense, but as a defining moment that separated his understanding of himself before combat from his understanding of himself after. The battle for Saipan continued for 3 weeks after the Japanese charge on June 15, 1944. Tony Stein remained in action throughout the campaign, operating his Browning machine gun in defensive positions and supporting offensive operations as the 4th Marine Division fought its way across the island. He participated in the assault on Mount Tapochau, the volcanic peak that dominated the island's interior and served as the anchor of Japanese defensive positions. He provided covering fire during attacks on Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge, terrain features that acquired their names from casualties sustained in taking them. His actions on the first day of the invasion were documented in after-action reports compiled by battalion and regimental staff officers. These reports noted effective defensive fire that stopped Japanese counterattacks against beach positions and specifically mentioned individual machine gunners whose actions had been critical in maintaining the perimeter. Stein's name appeared in these reports, along with descriptions of the tactical situation he had faced and decisions he had made under fire. The recommendation for recognition moved through the military awards system with bureaucratic slowness characteristic of such processes. Officers at battalion level endorsed the recommendation and forwarded it to regimental headquarters. Regimental staff reviewed documentation, compared it to criteria for various awards, and made their own recommendation to division headquarters. Division staff conducted their review, considering not only specific actions but also broader context of the Saipan campaign and the precedent any award would set for future cases. The question facing awards reviewers wasn't whether Stein's actions had been effective or necessary. The tactical outcome demonstrated clearly that his decision to fire without orders had been correct given circumstances. The question was whether those actions merited formal recognition beyond acknowledgement that he had performed his duties effectively. Thousands of Marines on Saipan had performed their duties effectively. Many had shown individual initiative in difficult situations. The award system couldn't recognize every instance of competent performance without diluting the meaning of military decorations, the criteria that ultimately determined the level of recognition. focused on several factors. First, the severity of the tactical situation. Stein had faced an overwhelming enemy force while isolated from his chain of command and without crew members to assist in operating the weapon. Second, the significance of the outcome. His actions had prevented a breakthrough that could have compromised entire beach defense. Third, the degree of risk. He had deliberately violated doctrine and accepted possibility of disciplinary action in favor of accomplishing the mission. Fourth, the scale of impact. His fire had stopped an attack by several hundred enemy soldiers, inflicting substantial casualties and disrupting Japanese operational plans. Based on these factors, Division Headquarters approved the award of the Silver Star Medal, the third highest decoration for valor in the United States military. The citation accompanying the award described Stein's actions in formal language, emphasizing the tactical situation, decisions he made, and outcome of the engagement. It noted his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy, and his initiative and sound tactical judgment in face of overwhelming enemy assault. The medal itself was presented in a ceremony conducted several weeks after the battle, after Saipan had been secured and the 4th Marine Division had time to reorganize and absorb replacements for casualties. Stein stood in formation with other Marines being recognized for their actions during the campaign, while a colonel read citations and pinned medals on uniform jackets. The ceremony lasted perhaps 30 minutes, a brief formal acknowledgement of actions that had taken place in circumstances far removed from parade ground formality. For Stein, the recognition was meaningful, but also somewhat disconnected from his memory of the event. The citation described his actions in heroic terms, emphasizing courage and tactical judgment. His own memory centered on different aspects: the isolation and uncertainty of the moment, the violation of doctrine he had been taught to follow, the weight of the decision to fire, and the faces of men who had died under his gun. The official narrative of heroism and personal experience of combat existed in parallel but didn't fully align. The broader significance of Stein's actions lay not in their uniqueness, but in their typicality. Throughout the Pacific War, young Marines in similar situations made similar decisions, balancing doctrine against tactical reality, following training while adapting to circumstances training hadn't fully anticipated. The success of American forces in the Pacific depended not only on material superiority and sound operational planning, but also on the ability of individual Marines to exercise judgment at the tactical level when communications failed, when leaders were killed, when the situation deviated from planning. Assumptions after action. Reports from Saipan that documented Stein's actions and similar incidents throughout the campaign became part of the institutional learning process that continuously refined Marine Corps doctrine during World War II. Staff officers at division and corps level analyzed these reports, looking for patterns that suggested doctrinal deficiencies or areas where training could be improved. The pattern they identified regarding machine gun employment was clear: doctrine written for ideal conditions with full crews and functioning. Communications often required adaptation when those conditions didn't exist. The specific issue was fire discipline versus individual initiative. Machine gun doctrine emphasized coordinated fire and ammunition conservation for sound tactical reasons that remained valid in most situations. But when individual gunners found themselves isolated from command and control, facing immediate threats requiring instant response, strict adherence to fire discipline could result in tactical failure. The challenge was developing doctrine that preserved benefits of coordination and conservation while allowing appropriate flexibility for exceptional circumstances. The solution developed in revised training materials and doctrinal publications issued in late 1944 and early 1945 wasn't to abandon fire discipline, but to provide clearer guidance on when deviation was justified. Machine gunners were taught explicit criteria for making decisions in absence of orders. If communications weren't functioning and no orders could be received, the gunner had authority to engage immediate threats. If the position was in danger of being overrun and no support was available, the gunner could fire final protective fire on his own initiative. If crew members were casualties and the tactical situation required immediate action, the gunner could operate the weapon alone. These modifications to doctrine acknowledged the reality that combat rarely conformed to planning assumptions. Communications equipment failed, leaders were killed or wounded, positions became isolated. In these circumstances, the Marine Corps needed individual Marines who understood both standard procedures and the principles behind them well enough to adapt appropriately. The goal wasn't to replace disciplined following, of doctrine with unlimited individual discretion, but to develop Marines who could exercise informed judgment about when deviation from standard procedures was necessary. Training. Implications of this refined doctrine were significant. Machine gun training at Camp Pendleton and other Marine Corps bases began including more scenarios where students had to make decisions without explicit orders. Instructors created training problems where communications failed, where assistant gunners became casualties, where tactical situations required immediate response before coordination with adjacent positions was possible. The goal was to develop judgment required to distinguish between situations where doctrine should be followed strictly and situations where adaptation was necessary. This emphasis on tactical judgment at lowest levels was characteristic of Marine Corps institutional culture and distinguished American military practice from that of many other nations during World War II. The American approach, particularly in the Marine Corps, accepted risks of individual decision-making in favor of tactical flexibility. This approach worked because it was paired with extensive training that developed both technical competence and judgment. Marines learned not only how to operate weapons, but also when and why to use them. They learned not only standard procedures, but also the principles that made those procedures effective. They developed ability to analyze tactical situations, recognize when standard procedures were appropriate, and adapt when circumstances required. The success of this approach was visible throughout the Pacific Campaign. Individual Marines repeatedly made tactical decisions that deviated from strict doctrine, but achieved mission objectives. Tony Stein survived the Battle of Saipan, the campaign that tested every aspect of Marine Corps training and doctrine in the crucible of sustained combat against a determined enemy, fighting on terrain they had fortified for months. He survived weeks of fighting through the island's interior, assaults on fortified positions, constant artillery and mortar fire, heat and exhaustion, and psychological strain of continuous operations. He returned to Hawaii with the 4th Marine Division after the island was secured in early July 1944, and he participated in training and reorganization that prepared the division for its next operation. That next operation was Iwo Jima, the small volcanic island, less than 8 square miles in area, that would consume American and Japanese lives in proportions that shocked even veterans of previous Pacific campaigns. The 4th Marine Division landed on the eastern beaches of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, as part of a 3-division assault against Japanese defenses that had been prepared with unusual thoroughness. Tony Stein went ashore in the initial assault waves, carrying not his Browning machine gun, but a weapon he had fabricated himself from the wing-mounted machine gun of a destroyed aircraft, a weapon he called his Stinger that provided devastating firepower at close range. On the first day of the Iwo Jima invasion, Corporal Tony Stein, promoted since Saipan, repeatedly charged Japanese pillboxes and fortified positions, using his improvised weapon to suppress enemy fire while other Marines maneuvered. To destroy positions with demolitions and flamethrowers, he made multiple trips back to the beach to obtain ammunition and to evacuate wounded Marines, exposing himself to enemy fire each time. His actions that day were extraordinary, even by standards of Marine Corps combat operations, displaying courage and initiative that exceeded anything expected of individual Marines. On March 1, 1945, 10 days into the battle for Iwo Jima, Tony Stein was killed in action. The specific circumstances of his death weren't recorded in detail, lost in chaos of combat operations where thousands of Marines were engaged simultaneously across the small island. He was 20 years old. His body was recovered and buried temporarily in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima, then later reinterred in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. The recommendation for recognition of his actions on the first day of the Iwo Jima invasion moved through the award system with the same bureaucratic process that had reviewed his Saipan actions. But the scale and significance of what he had accomplished on February 19, 1945 exceeded criteria for any award except the highest. On June 27, 1945, President Harry Truman presented the Medal of Honor posthumously to Tony Stein's widow at a ceremony in Washington. The citation described actions that went far beyond the tactical judgment and fire discipline that had characterized his performance at Saipan, actions that represented the extreme limit of courage and self-sacrifice, the trajectory from private, first class making a doctrine-violating decision on a Saipan beach to corporal, dying in combat on Iwo Jima after actions that earned the nation's highest military decoration spanned 9 months and encompassed the transformation of a competent Marine into an exceptional warrior. But the essential character that enabled both sets of actions was consistent: the ability to analyze tactical situations under extreme stress, to make sound decisions despite uncertainty and fear, to accept personal risk in accomplishing the mission, and to place mission accomplishment and welfare of fellow Marines above personal safety and adherence to bureaucratic procedures. The story of Tony Stein's decision to fire without orders on June 15th, 1944 is significant not because it was unique, but because it was representative. Throughout the Pacific War, thousands of young Marines faced similar moments of decision, situations where doctrine and reality diverged, where following orders strictly might result in tactical failure, where individual judgment had to substitute for coordination and planning. Most of these decisions were never documented in after-action reports or recognized with formal awards. They were simply part of the continuous flow of tactical adaptation that characterized combat operations. The institutional significance of these collective individual decisions was profound. They demonstrated that the Marine Corps had succeeded in developing not just technically competent Marines who could operate weapons and follow procedures, but thinking Marines who understood the principles behind procedures well enough to adapt appropriately. This capability wasn't the result of lowering standards or accepting poor discipline. It was the result of intensive training that developed both skills and judgment, of doctrine that provided clear guidance while allowing appropriate flexibility, and of leadership that trusted junior Marines to make decisions at the tactical level. The personal significance for individuals who made these decisions varied. Some, like Tony Stein, went on to further acts of heroism and were recognized accordingly. Others served their time in combat, made their decisions, accomplished their missions, and returned home to civilian life without formal recognition beyond standard campaign medals awarded to all participants. The absence of medals didn't diminish what they had accomplished or the burden they carried. The psychological burden of combat, particularly for machine gunners who killed at scale rather than in individual engagements, was substantial and lifelong. The memory of faces seen through gun sights, of bodies falling under sustained fire, of the mechanical process of killing dozens of human beings in minutes, couldn't be fully processed or reconciled with peacetime morality. Most veterans didn't speak of these experiences except with other veterans who shared the context and wouldn't judge. The broader society that benefited from their actions often preferred not to hear the specific details of how those actions were accomplished. The technical aspects of what Stein accomplished that morning on Saipan deserve closer examination to understand the full scope of the challenge he faced. Operating a Browning M1919 medium machine gun as a solo operator without an assistant gunner or ammunition carrier represented a significant deviation from the weapon's intended employment. The gun was designed around the assumption of a 3-man crew, precisely because the physical and cognitive demands of effective operation exceeded what one person could reasonably manage under combat stress. The gunner's primary responsibility was controlling the weapon itself, maintaining proper sight picture, traversing smoothly across the sector of fire, adjusting elevation for range, recognizing and correcting malfunctions, and making real-time decisions about target priority and engagement. The assistant gunner's role was equally critical, feeding ammunition belts smoothly into the weapon to prevent jams, monitoring barrel temperature to prevent overheating, helping to move the weapon and tripod when position changes were necessary, and providing security for the gun position against close assault. The ammunition carrier's function was logistical, but no less important, bringing forward the heavy cloth belts from storage points, often under fire, maintaining sufficient ammunition at the gun position to sustain operations, and serving as a replacement crew member if the gunner or assistant gunner became a casualty. When Stein found himself alone with the weapon, he had to perform all 3 roles simultaneously, while under the psychological pressure of an imminent assault by hundreds of enemy soldiers. The physical act of reloading the Browning under these circumstances required a level of practiced skill that only intensive training could develop. The feed cover had to be opened, the empty belt removed, the new belt positioned with the first round properly aligned in the feed tray, the cover closed, and the charging handle pulled to chamber the first round. Each of these steps required precise hand movements and proper sequencing. Any error in the process could result in a malfunction that would take precious seconds to clear. Stein executed 3 such reloads in the space of approximately approximately 2 minutes while under the enormous stress of watching hundreds of enemy soldiers charging his position. The fact that he completed these reloads successfully, without apparent malfunctions, speaks to the quality of his training and his ability to perform complex motor tasks under extreme duress. Many machine gunners in similar situations made errors during reloading that resulted in weapon stoppages at critical moments, sometimes with fatal consequences. The decision-making process Stein went through in the seconds before opening fire also merits examination. Military decision-making under stress is a topic that has received considerable study by psychologists and military theorists. Research consistently shows that effective decision-making in combat doesn't follow the rational, deliberative process often assumed in peacetime planning. There simply isn't time for careful weighing of alternatives and systematic analysis of consequences.